Alexis, see you. Lauren, see you. Okay, is that everybody? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the exam. I'd like there to be more people in here for that. We're missing a lot of people still. So maybe I'll wait another minute as people are coming in. You guys have seen your scores now, so I'm guessing there's a little bit of a panic going on. The test was rough across the board. I have a lot of people contacting me wanting to go over their exam, which is obviously difficult to do in this situation. I can't hand it back to you the way I would if we were in class. So, I mean, I could one-on-one Zoom with you and pull your exam up and talk about it, except that I have 200 students, and so I'm not gonna be able to do that with everyone. If you want to do that, I mean, my office hours are the best time to do that. My office hours are limited, so and I know that I'm guessing that most people want that to be private. So probably what I'll do if I have a lot of people wanting to do that is I'll set up like 5-minute appointments during my office hours so people can come in, have 5 minutes with me, go over their test. Shannon, you can't hear me? Is anyone else having trouble hearing me?
No, Professor, the sound is good.
Okay, so Shannon, I don't know what's going on with yours. So still I won't be able to fit everybody in doing it that way, but at least some of you can do that, and I can maybe address some of your concerns here in general. So as I was grading, I was making a list of common errors. So like if we were in class, I would normally go over some of the common errors, but I have a full page of them. And for me to go over them again would be basically reteaching everything I've taught in the last 3 weeks. Which, first of all, I don't think would be necessary because I'm pretty sure I covered it clearly and thoroughly the first time. And also because you guys have recordings of all these lectures. So if you didn't understand it and you need to hear it again, you can go back and listen to those lectures. So I don't really want to take up time out of this third section of the class reviewing the older material. I might just make a couple of points, but I have a lot of people, the short answer is what I'm most concerned about, because the short answer, you have to have a good understanding of the concept to be able to explain it to me. So the short answer is more important to me than the multiple choice. And I had a lot of people, way too many people with absolutely nothing to say on any of the short answer. And I'd say a good 85% of my students, and that's not just in this class, but in all of my classes, 85% of my students didn't know how to do the speed calculation. Did better on the energy expenditure calculation, but not a clue on the speed calculation, and giving me answers like 160, which I was asking for miles per hour. So obviously there's something wrong there. So, you know, I don't really understand coming into this test, not knowing how to do the calculations that we literally spent 3 or 4 lectures on. Not understanding arterial autoregulation, the difference between arterial autoregulation and cardiac autoconduction, which I specifically emphasized several times, don't confuse the two. Not understanding the difference between relative and absolute VO2, not being able to explain glycolysis fatigue is a huge one. I even told you guys, and we learned this before we went on the online, we learned glycolysis fatigue. And I said, 100% chance this is going to be on your test. And a lot of people, no clue. And I want to talk about that one specifically because fatigue is important. Understanding fatigue when you finish an exercise physiology class is pretty major. So the question on the test was something like the person was doing 10-second sprints, like, I don't know, 5 rounds of 10-second sprints or whatever they were with 20 seconds of rest in between, something like that. And I asked for the major causes, the causes of fatigue in their primary system. So I had a lot of people telling me PCR depletion. So if you're doing 5 or 10 sets, I don't even remember what the question was, but it doesn't matter. If you're doing that many sets of 10-second sprints with 20 seconds rest, you're not primarily in ATP PCR system. You're only in ATP PCR system for the first sprint. And if you're only resting for 20 seconds, I guarantee the rest of the sprints are in glycolysis because you haven't recovered the ATP PCR system. So then you have to explain fatigue and glycolysis. Okay, so I had a lot of people talking about PCR depletion, and then at the very last sentence say, oh, and the lactic acid might be a problem, but then not explaining anything. So first of all, if you're in the ATP PCR system, lactic acid is not a problem. Lactic acid is not produced in the ATP PCR system. So if you're saying that's the system the person's in, shouldn't be mentioning lactic acid. If you're mentioning lactic acid, you have some sense they should be in glycolysis, so you need to explain how the lactic acid is causing fatigue. So we talked about hydrogen. Remember, it's not the lactic acid causing fatigue, it's the hydrogen. We talked about 3 ways hydrogen can cause fatigue, and we went over those in detail, 3 separate ways. One was inhibiting PFK, one was inhibiting glycogen phosphorylase. You had to explain those specifically in detail all the way down to how they inhibit muscle contraction. Then you needed to explain competitive inhibition, and then you needed to explain the inorganic phosphate accumulation. Okay, I know I spent a lot of time on it. I know I told you it was going to be on the test. I don't understand coming into the test not knowing that. I had a lot of, the arterial autoregulation question. Those of you who understood it was at the arterioles and not in the heart, talked about the 6 conditions, but then talked about it causing vasodilation at the skin. So many people said that, and I just don't understand. I mean, it's like, and this happened on a lot of questions, you're throwing out words that you know go here. Like, I know the 6 local conditions go with arterial autoregulation. I know vasodilation goes with the arterial autoregulation, so I'm just going to make up some information and throw out these words and have no connection. It's like you know that the words go there, but you don't understand how to connect them and what the process is. Okay, arterial autoregulation is during exercise, those conditions that are occurring at the exercising muscle are triggering the vasodilation for the purpose of bringing in blood flow to the exercising muscle. So to say that we're getting those 6 local conditions at the exercising muscle and it's triggering vasodilation at the skin doesn't make any sense. Epinephrine triggers vasodilation at the skin. And this was one of the multiple choice questions or the fill-in questions or drop down, I don't remember what it was, but it was in the other section, and a lot of people got that wrong. What's causing vasodilation at the skin? A lot of people put, so the question was, is vasodilation at the skin active or passive, and what triggers it? And I'd say most people put it's passive and it's caused by chemoreceptors. So I know that I went over epinephrine causes vasoconstriction everywhere except in the vessels near the skin. Vessels near the skin have different receptors for the epinephrine, so they respond to the epinephrine by vasodilating. Okay, that's completely different from the vasodilation at the exercising muscle that's caused by the conditions at the exercising muscle. Why would the conditions at the exercising muscle cause vasodilation at the skin? It's just, you're throwing out words without connecting them, which I mean, like I talked about at the beginning of the semester, there's only so much I can do here. I feel like I'm covering the information. You still have the study guide. You now have access to recordings of the lectures, which you all did before, but now you have video recordings. I'm lecturing live. I'm not posting recordings that you can't interact with me if you have a question. And I think I'm getting a false sense of security because I'm getting, in every class, I have about 5 students who answer my questions and understand and did well on the test. So I'm getting a false sense of security that you guys are with me here. And the other 40 people in the class are failing. So I need you to be honest with yourself about how much work you put in preparing for that exam. Compare it to your grade on the first exam and compare the amount of work. Be honest with yourself and compare the amount of work and the quality of work that you put in for this exam. Because I can't control that. So the thing is, I don't know if you guys in this situation are expecting that grades are going to be inflated and everybody's going to be passed. And that's not the case. This is not a GE class that I can just pass you through with no consequence. Okay, this is a core class, one of the last core classes in your major, and I will not pass you if you don't understand the information. So if you are in a situation, because of the shutdown, if you are in a situation where you cannot either physically or emotionally put in the time to learn this information, then you need to take the options that the university is giving you for either the early withdrawal or the credit, no credit, and take this class when you can put in the work. Because I'm going to say this again, I will not pass you just out of pity because of the lockdown if you don't understand the information. Okay, so you still have 30% of your grade left as the final. And so, I mean, you still have control over how your grade turns out. You know, I know a lot of people want to blame the structure of the test and say it was difficult to to pace myself and I couldn't go back on the questions and that was so stressful. And I understand that's stressful. And I understand when that was different. And I understand that's an adjustment. But the short answer questions were at the beginning of your test. If you understood the information, you would have answered those questions correctly. So if you can explain to me the concepts in the short answer questions and you just explained those really well and understood the concepts and then ran out of time on the rest of the test, I would be seeing this differently. That's not what happened. Calculations, no idea how to do them. Fatigue, no idea how to explain it. Cardiac conduction, don't know what it is. I have this the example of the question of the person is sitting in their chair and they start walking and then jogging and then running and then sprinting. And the question is, explain what is happening to their heart rate and why. And I had people talking about oxygen deficit and EPOC and the relationship between consumption and requirement. And all of that is true. All of that is happening during that exercise. Well, not all of it, because she's not reaching steady state because she's increasing her intensity, but none of that answers the question. The question was what's happening to her heart rate. If she's sitting down, her heart rate's at resting heart rate, right? If she starts moving around, she's gonna have a withdrawal of her parasympathetic nervous system, decreased vagal tone, right? If she goes running and then sprinting, it's gonna be the sympathetic nervous system taking over through the sympathetic cardiac nerve and epinephrine acting on the SA node, okay? I know that I went over this, and I don't think the concepts are that complicated. So I'm not sure what else to say, except that if you're not understanding the information, I'm here for office hours. You have Mira, you have Naz, you have Armin, you have Amy, all have office hours. They will all do one-on-ones with you. They're doing workshops. They did, I don't even know how many reviews they did. So if you're not understanding the information, are you using your resources? Still possible to get together and Zoom with people and study. Are you filling out your study guide? Do you remember that filling out your study guide is not studying? And do you have blank pieces of paper practicing writing stuff out? You guys need to be honest with yourself, because you're going to get out of this what you put in it, same as before. Same as before. Okay. So, one question everybody did great on was the control of blood pressure question, explaining how the sympathetic nervous system is in charge of increasing blood pressure during exercise. Almost everyone got that right, which I don't know if that means you did a good job memorizing that chart or if you had that chart already with you, whatever. That question was good. So when you study something, you can learn it. Okay. I don't want to spend any more time on it because I have a lot of information to cover. If anyone wants to say something, I mean, I want feedback here. If you think there's something that I can do differently other than just make the test really easy, because that I'm not going to do. I hope you understand why I can't make it so you can go back on the questions. There was a lot of cheating going on, and I've got to minimize that. And that's one of the few ways I can do that. So I know it's not ideal, but it needs to happen that way. So if you have any feedback you want to give me right now in this moment, or if you want to email me, or if you want to come to office hours and talk, I'm good with that. Okay, otherwise, we can talk about one-on-one going over your test during my office hour time. Okay, so if anyone wants to jump in right now and make a comment or ask a question, totally open to that.
What did you see compared to multiple choice or short answer? What did the class struggle on most? Like types of questions.
Most of the things I wrote down were regarding the short answer questions. Yeah, I mean, with the fill-in and the multiple choice, I mean, most people didn't know what the caloric equivalent converts what to what, which if you were able to do the energy expenditure calculation, you should know which of those numbers that you used was the caloric equivalent. So what the caloric equivalent converts from what to what. The caloric equivalent is the 5 calories per liter. So remember, that's what gets us from oxygen consumption to energy expenditure, or the other way around. So I had a lot of people saying that's how you get from METs to something else, or how you get from absolute oxygen consumption to relative oxygen consumption. I mean, I don't know what to say there. Okay, anyway.
I have a question.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Do you know how the final is going to be? Is it going to be the same format? Like, I mean, not format, but Like, is it gonna? Well, yeah, I guess. Is it gonna go the same way?
Well, it's going to be on the lockdown browser.
Mhm.
You're going to have one question at a time, and you're not going to be able to go back. So that's going to be similar. What I'm thinking of doing is separating the multiple choice section from the short answer section and giving you separate time blocks so that the time you spend on your multiple choice does not eat into the time you spend on the short answer, or whichever way I said it, so that they're separate, so that timing is a little bit less of an issue. And the questions will be more applied. So like when I give you a scenario, this person is doing this exercise, what is their cause of fatigue? As opposed to me just saying, list the causes of fatigue in the system. Be a little bit more applied, a lot more applied. But it is cumulative. So there will be some information from day one and all the way through. And I will be spending time emphasizing which topics from the older material are important, and we'll be combining them, integrating them in with the newer information. So I'll spend some time on that. Okay. Okay, so we started chapter 8, right? Responses to exercise, acute exercise, and we filled out the first side of this table, right? The last thing we went over was submax cardiac output, is that right? Okay, so let's review this a little bit. Tatiana, what happens to resting heart rate as exercise intensity increases and why?
It's the same because it's not affected by exercise intensity.
Good.
So there's an example I wrote down. It's so if your heart rate's at 70 BPM and you're on a treadmill and the speed is increasing, oh wait, sorry, that's something else. That's not what I was gonna read.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. So your resting heart rate is not going to be affected by changing your exercise intensity.
Right.
Justin, what happens to max heart rate as intensity increases?
As exercise intensity increases, your max heart rate stays the same because for one is your max, and it is also solely determined by your age.
Mm-hmm. Good. Andrew, what happens to submax heart rate as intensity increases and why?
Submax heart rate increases to the withdrawal PNS system, which decreases vagal tone to act on the SA node, which increases heart rate, and then also increasing SNS activity, which acts on the sympathetic cardiac nerve, and which releases epinephrine acting on the SA node to act on or increase heart rate.
Very good. Emily, what happens to AVO2 difference submax as intensity increases? AVO2 difference submax.
The exercise will cause it to increase because the muscles are consuming more energy.
More oxygen. Yeah.
Oh yeah, oxygen.
Yeah, perfect. Ariel, what happens to submax stroke volume as intensity increases and why?
Submax stroke volume is going to go up, and there's a huge process in regards to that.
Can you give me a shortened version?
Yeah, let me pull it up. I didn't really.
Okay, Lauren, I'm going to pass it to you.
Can I try?
Yeah, Lauren. Oh, who said that? Shannon, go ahead.
With stroke volume, end diastolic volume increases and end systolic volume decreases. And that is due with the end diastolic volume to the, oh, you want the short version, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so for increase in venous return and left ventricular distensibility, and then for end systolic volume decreasing, it's increased left ventricular contractility and decreased resistance.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And understand that you have a much detailed answer you could give me if I asked you If I ask you for a detailed answer, I want more information than that. Okay, right now I'm asking for the short answer, and I'm not going to go over that whole map again. You have the map. You can use it to explain that concept in more detail. Emma, what happens to submax cardiac output as intensity increases, and why?
I only have increases, but I didn't know the why.
Okay, Gwen, why?
Because of an increase in heart rate and stroke volume.
Good. So remember, cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. So changes in cardiac output have to be explained through changes in heart rate and stroke volume. So if I were to ask for a detailed answer on that one, you'd have to explain the increases in heart rate and explain the increases in stroke volume. Okay, any questions on any of those? I'm gonna flip over the other side of the table. We're gonna move on. So the next one is VO2 max. So Lauren, I'll go back to you. What do you think happens to VO2 max as exercise intensity increases?
I think it would stay the same because it's the max.
It's a max, right? Remember, we have a resting VO2. Rachel, what is resting VO2?
Resting VO2 is the amount of volume of oxygen consumed per minute. So that's at rest. So we're not exercising.
Can you give me a number for it?
At rest, that would be 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute, which is 1 minute.
Good. So we have resting oxygen consumption, we have a max oxygen consumption. Everything in between when you're exercising is submax. Okay, oh, and that reminds me, there's another question on the test of the two people both jogging at the same speed and grade. I forget, let's say it was 6 miles per hour on a 3% grade, whatever it was. One person weighed like 140 pounds, one person weighed like 190 pounds. And the question was, are they at the same absolute oxygen consumption? Are they at the same relative oxygen consumption? Are they consuming the same number of calories? I forget what the other options were, and most people got that wrong. So if they're both jogging at 6 miles per hour, 3% grade, we know something is the same of those three things. One of those three things is the same because we can calculate something for 6 miles per hour and a 3% grade. What can we calculate for 6 miles per hour and a 3% grade?
VO2 max.
Not VO2 max.
It's absolute.
Not absolute. This is the ACSM running formula.
It would be the VO2 submax.
It would be VO2 submax in what's the unit?
Relative.
mLs per kg per minute, right? We can plug into the equation VO2 in mLs per kg per minute equals 0.2 times speed plus 0.9 times speed times grade plus 3.5. So we can put in the 6 miles per hour. We just have to convert it into meters per minute, right? We put in the grade. We calculate submax VO2 because that speed and grade requires a given amount of oxygen in mLs per kg per minute. Both of those people are consuming the same relative oxygen per kilogram. They have the same mLs per kg per minute. There's no possible way for them to have the same absolute oxygen consumption. If one person weighs 50 pounds more than the other person and they're jogging at the same speed and grade, just common sense tells you that the person who weighs more is going to burn more calories and consume more total oxygen. But the way you compare them is relative per milliliters per kilogram per minute. They're working at the same intensity. Any given intensity has a given oxygen requirement. Okay, I know that's a tough concept to grasp. 6 miles per hour on a 3% grade has a given oxygen requirement. Relative, no matter who you are, same relative oxygen consumption requirement for that intensity. The larger you are, the more absolute oxygen you will consume and the more calories you will burn.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know why I said absolute. I just got confused.
Oh no, that's okay. This is to everyone because I'd say 85 to 90% of people got that question on the test wrong. So this was not directed at you, Emily. This was directed at everyone. That just reminded me of that question. So let me put up my whiteboard. And we said VO2 max is staying the same. I'm going to give you a formula for VO2. Oxygen consumption equals cardiac output times AVO2 difference. And I will assume right now that you know what AVO2 difference is. Okay, so I can break down the cardiac output into heart rate and stroke volume. So I'm going to say VO2 equals heart rate times stroke volume times AVO2 difference. Okay, so if we're talking about VO2 max, then we're talking about heart rate max, stroke volume max. These two things together give us cardiac output max and AVO2 difference max. Okay, so what happens to heart rate max as intensity increases?
Stays the same.
Stays the same. What happens to stroke volume max as intensity increases? Don't you have class at 9:45, Elliot? Okay, what happens to stroke volume max as intensity increases?
Stay the same because it's the max.
Okay, so therefore cardiac output max stays the same. What happens to AVO2 difference max?
It's not
Stays the
affected.
same.
Stays the same. So you can explain that VO2 max is not affected by increasing exercise intensity because heart rate max, stroke volume max, cardiac output max, and AVO2 difference max are not affected. This equation, actually before I move on, let me do this. I'm gonna write this
Can you
again.
repeat that last part?
VO2 max is not affected by exercise intensity because heart rate max, stroke volume max, cardiac output max, and AVO2 difference max are all unaffected. That's just, I'm just looking at the formula. Okay, I'm gonna write out this formula again. Okay, what I want you to do is write out that formula and take all of your colored pens, use all of your different colors to highlight this. Put stars on it. Draw all kinds of attention to it. Let's see. Okay, somehow make sure it's known that this is very, very important. Okay, this formula is called the Fick equation. Not to be confused with Fick's law. It's different. Fick equation is VO2 equals heart rate times stroke volume times AVO2 difference. This formula is very, 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 very important for everything we're going to talk about in this class over the next 3 weeks and in 446. Okay, if you have Andrews, first day, day one, he's going to ask you what the Fick equation is. And I have 446 instructors coming back to me saying the students don't know what the Fick equation is. And I know it's not because I didn't teach it or because I didn't emphasize it, because I always emphasize it. It's very, 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 very important to exercise physiology. Okay, so what I suggest you do is type it out and print it out on a piece of paper as large as you can the formula, print it out, laminate it, stick it on your fridge so you see it every time you go to your fridge. Print out another one, laminate it, put it under your pillow. Some kind of osmosis thing happens there. If you're really serious, you can take a Sharpie and write it backwards on your forehead, and that way you see it every time you look in the mirror. Okay, that's how important this is. You must know this equation. It's not for VO2 max or VO2 submax, it's just VO2. VO2 equals heart rate times stroke volume times AVO2 difference. Okay, if we're talking about VO2 max, then it's heart rate max times stroke volume max times AVO2 difference max. Okay, if we're talking about VO2 submax, then it's going to be VO2 submax equals heart rate submax times stroke volume submax times AVO2 difference submax. And that includes cardiac output submax. Okay. So what do you think happens to VO2 submax as exercise intensity increases? It increases. We have already talked about that. When intensity increases, heart rate increases, stroke volume increases, your breathing rate increases, lactate production increases, oxygen consumption increases. We already talked about that. Okay, so now we need to talk about why. So when you talk about why, you have to look at the formula. What does VO2 depend on? What happens to heart rate submax as intensity increases, and why? Who wants that one?
It increases, right? So it would be the same as on the first page for decrease in PNS, decrease in vagal tone, increase in SNS activity with increase in epinephrine and the sympathetic cardiac nerve acting on the SA node.
Perfect. AJ, what happens to submax stroke volume as intensity increases?
It increases because of the increase in end diastolic volume minus the decrease in end systolic volume, because it causes the increase in end diastolic volume causes increased venous return and increased left ventricular distensibility, and then the decrease in end systolic volume causes the increase in left ventricular contraction and decreased resistance against left ventricular contraction.
Good. Just do this real quick. Does the increased end diastolic volume cause the increased venous return?
Yes.
What's causing what here? Venous return is bringing blood back to the heart. End diastolic volume is the amount of blood in the left ventricle when it's full. Does bringing blood to the heart cause the increase in the amount of blood in the heart, or does the amount of blood in the heart cause the increase of blood coming to the heart?
It's the first one, I think. The more that comes back, the more is pumped, right?
Right. The increase in venous return is causing the increase in end diastolic volume. Is the decrease in end systolic volume causing the decrease in resistance?
No.
Okay, so this is, just be careful with throwing out words like you know all these words go together, but this is something I run into a lot is the causation, what's causing what. So you throw out the words, but you have to make sure you're connecting them in a way that makes sense. Okay, but those are all the right things that go on there. Okay. Christian, what happens to AVO2 difference submax as intensity increases?
AV2 submax is wait, what was the question again?
What happens to AVO2 difference submax as exercise intensity increases, and why?
Oh, it increases because your heart rate and everything's going up.
Heart rate does not affect AVO2 difference.
Or your oxygen level is going up because you need to consume more, and yeah.
The oxygen level is going up. Okay, so we need to make sure we know what AVO2 difference is. Nicole, what is AVO2 difference?
It's the difference in oxygen between the arteries and the veins.
Good. So what happens to AVO2 difference submax as intensity increases?
Me?
Yes, please.
It increases because during exercise, you need to get oxygen to the exercising muscle, so it's consuming more, which means it's increasing.
Right. As the muscle consumes more oxygen, the AVO2 difference goes up. Okay, and cardiac output is going up because heart rate and stroke volume are going up. So this is a very important concept in exercise physiology. Why is oxygen consumption increasing as exercise intensity is increasing? Because heart rate is increasing, and we have an explanation for that. Stroke volume is increasing, we have an explanation for that, and that explains cardiac output increasing. And AVO2 difference is increasing, we have an explanation for that. Okay, this is a very important thing to understand. Okay, so if I ask you to explain in detail what's causing oxygen consumption to increase during exercise, you have to explain all of this. Everybody okay with that?
Isn't it also carbon dioxide? Because producing more CO2, doesn't that cause more inspiration?
Okay, so yes and no. Carbon dioxide will increase your respiration rate, but bringing oxygen, and that's mainly for the purpose of blowing off the carbon dioxide, okay? But bringing oxygen into the lungs is not oxygen consumption. Diffusing the oxygen from the lungs into the blood is not oxygen consumption. Oxygen consumption happens in the mitochondria at the end of the electron transport chain, which is reflected here.
Oh, so for that kind of inspiration, it's just to get the CO2 out, so it just goes in and out for the most part.
And we are during that process inspiring oxygen, but we're gonna inspire the oxygen. It's gonna diffuse into the blood, and then through cardiac output, we're gonna deliver it to the muscle. The muscle is gonna uptake it and consume it, and that's gonna be reflected here.
Mm-hmm.
So the cardiac output part is the delivery part, and the AVO2 difference is the uptake and consumption part. And we're going to talk about that more in the next chapter. But that's a good question. Okay, next on any other questions on this before I move on the table? Okay, next on the table is lactate threshold. Sophia Gomez, can you give me a definition of lactate threshold?
The point at which all the lactic acid accumulates as exercise intensity increases.
Okay, the point at which lactic acid begins to accumulate as intensity increases. And this was another issue on the test of people not being able to define this. People were defining it as the accumulation of lactic acid. That's not an appropriate definition here. Okay, it's the point at which lactic acid begins to accumulate. So the accumulation of lactic acid, this whole thing is the accumulation of lactic acid. Okay, lactate threshold is the point at which it begins to accumulate as intensity is increasing. Okay, so what do you think happens to lactate threshold as intensity increases? Increase, decrease, or stay the same?
Stay the same
Why?
because it's your threshold.
Good. It's a threshold. The lactate threshold is like a max. So remember we said that this is like a border between primarily aerobic exercise and when you start to have a significant anaerobic component. So this reflects like the maximum intensity that you could work at and still be primarily aerobic. Okay. Anything above that is going to rely heavily on your anaerobic system. So as you're increasing your intensity, something is increasing here. What's increasing?
Your lactic acid
Lactic
production.
acid levels, right? So if you're increasing your intensity, 4 miles per hour, 5 miles per hour, 6 miles per hour, 7 miles per hour, as you pass your lactate threshold, lactic acid production is going to ramp up because your mitochondria are full. Remember, you got to make this connection. The mitochondria fills up, so the hydrogen has to be dropped off somewhere, and the electron, it gets dropped off at pyruvate, starts creating lactic acid much faster than we can clear it, and it's accumulating. Okay, so let's say, so the average person, untrained person, hits their lactate threshold at what? 50% VO2 max. Okay, let's say for this person, that's 6 miles per hour. And by the way, what if I said, this is an untrained person, they hit their VO2 max at they hit their lactate threshold at 50% of their VO2 max, which is 6 miles per hour. You should be able to calculate what their VO2 max is. Oh, it sounds like a good question for the final. How would you do that? You can calculate VO2 for 6 miles per hour, right? With that formula, calculate VO2 for 6 miles per hour, and if that's 50% of their VO2 max, then you can calculate what their VO2 max is. That's something within reason that you should be able to figure out. Okay, but I digress. Anyway, so if this person hits their lactate threshold at 6 miles per hour, and they're increasing their intensity 5 miles per hour, 6 miles per hour, 7 miles per hour, 8 miles per hour, their blood lactate levels are increasing. Their lactate threshold didn't change. As they increased their intensity, their lactate threshold did not change. They passed their lactate threshold, but it did not change their lactate threshold. We can change the lactate threshold through training, right? And we talked about that, and that was a question on the test. You can train in high intensity, you can train in low intensity. Either way, it will increase your lactate threshold, but just increasing your speed on the treadmill not affect your lactate threshold. Everybody okay with that? Okay. Next on the table is blood pH. What happens to blood pH as exercise intensity increases?
Decreases.
It increases? Why? Decreases? Why?
Because the hydrogen accumulates because we're in glycolysis, so then this decreases our mitochondrial availability, and the accumulation of the hydrogen is what lowers our pH.
Good. So as you increase your exercise intensity, you're producing more lactic acid. Hydrogen from the lactic acid makes your blood more acidic, which is a lower pH. Plasma volume. What do you think happens to plasma volume as intensity increases?
Decreases.
Why?
Because of the perspiration that's coming from the plasma.
Yeah, you're sweating. The sweat that you're losing is coming from your plasma. So plasma levels drop because of sweating, and also because some of the plasma goes into your muscle when you're exercising, out of the blood and into the muscle. So 2 reasons plasma volume decreases during exercise. 1 is because of sweating. 2 is because of plasma going into the muscle. Red blood cell count. What do you think happens to red blood cell count as intensity increases? Emily says stays the same. Gwen says stay the same. Good. Your red blood cell count is not affected by increasing the speed on your treadmill. Does not trigger you to produce more red blood cells. It does not kill red blood cells. It does not affect your red blood cells, your red blood cell count. Training will. Intensity will not. Hematocrit. What do you think happens to hematocrit? Gwen says goes up.
Goes up.
Evelyn says goes up. Nick, why would hematocrit go up?
Because our plasma levels go down. And so we have the percentage, we have more formed elements compared to total blood volume.
Good. So remember that hematocrit is formed elements divided by total blood volume. So if your plasma level drops, but your red blood cell count stays the same, you're gonna have a higher percentage of your blood made of the formed elements, which is an increased hematocrit. Good. Okay, submax blood pressure, specifically talking about systolic blood pressure. What happens to systolic blood pressure as intensity increases? Rachel says it goes up. Did you guys do this in your lab at all? Talk about this in your lab? Remember, it's normal for blood pressure to increase as exercise intensity increases. Systolic blood pressure. Because the ventricle is contracting more forcefully, so the blood is coming out and hitting the walls of the aorta more forcefully, and that's what blood pressure is. So as you increase your intensity, systolic blood pressure is going to go up. Diastolic should not, because diastolic is during the relaxation of the ventricle. There's nothing happening to blood pressure at that point. So it's normal for systolic to go up. But let's look at the formula. Oops. I almost accidentally canceled the meeting. Okay, what's the formula for blood pressure? Short formula.
Cardiac output times peripheral resistance.
Okay. Let's do the expanded formula. Blood pressure equals heart rate times stroke volume times length times viscosity divided by radius to the fourth. These two things together make up cardiac output, and these two things together make up peripheral resistance. Okay, so we already said blood pressure is going to increase. This is submax systolic blood pressure. Okay, to talk about why blood pressure is increasing, what's causing the increases in blood pressure, we have to look at the formula. So this is all submax. So heart rate submax, stroke volume submax, cardiac output submax. What's happening to heart rate submax as intensity increases?
Is it increasing?
It's increasing, and we should have an explanation for that. What's happening to stroke volume submax as intensity is increasing?
Increases as well.
It's increasing, and we have an explanation for that. Therefore, cardiac output is increasing. Okay, let's talk about what's happening with peripheral resistance. What's happening in here? Is the length of our vessel changing as we increase our exercise intensity?
No.
No. Is our viscosity changing?
Yes.
What's happening to it?
Decreasing because the plasma is decreasing.
Yeah, and so hematocrit is low because the plasma is low. Okay, so decreased hematocrit because of the decrease in plasma. Okay, what's happening to radius?
Wouldn't hematocrit increase?
Yes, thank you. So viscosity would also increase. Thank you, Glenn. Increased hematocrit because you're losing plasma, so blood's getting thicker. Increased hematocrit, increased viscosity. What's happening to radius? Increase?
Mostly decreasing, right? Because it's vasoconstricting everywhere except the exercising muscle.
Okay, so decreased radius due to vasoconstriction because of epinephrine, right? What else is happening?
There is vasodilation because of arterial autoregulation at the exercising muscle, which increases the radius.
So there's a lot going on here within peripheral resistance. Remember we talked about how we can have vasoconstriction and vasodilation happening at the same time in different locations. We're losing plasma. So with all of this happening with peripheral resistance, we end up with an overall decrease in peripheral resistance as intensity increases because the vasodilation is significant.
Oh.
So how is it possible? So it looks like mathematically an increase in cardiac output and a decrease in peripheral resistance should make blood pressure stay the same. But we know blood pressure is increasing. So how is it possible for blood pressure to be increasing if peripheral resistance overall is decreasing?
Isn't it because it's decreasing at the exercising muscle? And not everywhere. It's increasing everywhere, but it's decreasing at the exercising muscle, right?
Overall, with everything that's happening in peripheral resistance, we're getting overall decrease in peripheral resistance. How is it possible for blood pressure to be increasing if peripheral resistance is decreasing?
Isn't it because heart rate and stroke volume doesn't affect the peripheral resistance? Like they're separate equations?
Okay, so why aren't these two things canceling each other out and getting no change in blood pressure?
The increase in cardiac output is more significant than the decrease in peripheral resistance.
Exactly. The increases in cardiac output are so large that it outweighs the decrease in peripheral resistance and causes blood pressure to increase. So if I were to ask you what's causing the increases in blood pressure during exercise, you can't say increases in cardiac output and peripheral resistance. That's not true. Okay? You can't even say increases in cardiac output and decreases in peripheral resistance. Since the decreases in peripheral resistance are not causing the increases in blood pressure. What's causing the increases in blood pressure?
Cardiac output.
Large increases in cardiac output. Okay, makes sense? Okay. Okay, I'm going to add one more thing to your table. Underneath submax blood pressure, put RER. Rodolfo, what is RER? What is the range and what does it mean?
The ranges are from 0.7 to 1, and if you're at 0.7, it's because you're using 100% fat, and at 1, it's because you're using 100% carbs.
Good. What does RER stand for?
Respiratory exchange ratio.
Good. And what would cause it to go above 1?
That one I honestly don't remember.
Lizette, what would cause RER to go above 1?
If you increase your intensity rate.
Well, increasing the intensity.
Like going above your lactic threshold.
Why?
Because you're consuming more. Does it have to do it? Actually, I don't remember.
Okay. Oh, I have raised hands. Justin, go ahead.
Wait. Okay. Since you're going at a higher intensity, you're producing more bicarbonate buffer, and one of the products of the bicarbonate buffer is non-metabolic CO2, which would cause the RER to go up.
Good. You're not producing more bicarbonate buffer. you are using more bicarbonate buffer.
Okay.
So remember RER is VCO2 over VO2. So the lower RER of 0.7 is fat, and the higher RER of 1 is carbohydrates. So relying more on carbohydrates brings you up to 1. If you're using 100% carbohydrates, that brings you up to 1. So relying on carbohydrates doesn't bring you over 1. What kicks you over 1 is the excess carbon dioxide that's unaccounted for. That comes from the bicarbonate buffer. Okay. Anyway, what happens to RER as exercise intensity increases? Does it increase, decrease, or stay the same?
Increases.
Increase.
Good. Why?
You're relying more on carbs.
Good. So as you increase your exercise intensity, rely more on carbohydrates, which drives the RER up towards 1. And then if you continue increasing your intensity, it'll even go above 1. Nick, why do we rely more on carbohydrates at the higher intensities?
Because we're in the metabolic system that requires that substrate to be used, which is glycolysis.
Okay, so we're working more anaerobically as the intensity goes up. Remember that we're also using the fast twitch fibers, which work primarily anaerobically. Okay, and this relates back to the crossover concept. Okay, so integrate all of that information. Good. Okay, so we finished that section of the table. I have 2 more quick concepts in this chapter that we'll end with today, and then on Wednesday we'll start the next chapter. Okay, so my next topic is not on this table. It's ventilatory threshold. Ventilatory threshold is the point at which your pulmonary ventilation rate increases rapidly as intensity increases. Point at which your ventilation rate increases or begins to increase rapidly as intensity increases. Ventilatory threshold, the point at which your ventilation rate begins to increase rapidly as intensity increases. So I'm going to have intensity on the x-axis. I'm going to have ventilation rate y-axis. Low, medium, high. Low, medium, high. Okay, so at the lower intensities, your breathing rate is not significantly affected, but at some point you're going to hit an intensity where there's going to be a rapid increase in your ventilation rate. That point where you start seeing a rapid increase in your ventilation rate is your ventilatory threshold. Does this remind you of anything?
Lactate threshold.
Okay. Do you think they're connected?
I don't know. Maybe.
Gwen is saying yes. They are connected. Can someone make a guess as to how they are connected?
Does it have to do with the clearing of lactic acid and then the bicarbonate buffer as we're breathing out more CO2? Does it have to do anything with that?
It does.
So then that means it would increase your ventilation rate. And I don't know where to go from that, but that's how I think it.
So, but you picked up on the connection being the bicarbonate buffer. Okay, so you hit your lactate threshold at the same time you hit your ventilatory threshold. Because when you start using your bicarbonate buffer a lot, you're producing a lot of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has an effect on your ventilation rate, right? Carbon dioxide triggers the inspiratory centers in your brain to increase your breathing rate for the purpose of blowing off the carbon dioxide. Okay, so your ventilation rate is going to start to increase at the same time your lactic acid starts to accumulate. The endosteric threshold mirrors the lactate threshold. The link between the two is the bicarbonate buffer. Okay, so your respiration is connected to your blood pH. Okay, we talked about that before. Okay, any questions on that? Happens at the same time. It happens at about the same time. Vanessa, go ahead.
Is there a specific number we're supposed to know? Whereas like lactate threshold, we know that it's 50% VO2. Is there a specific number for this one?
Well, if they happen at the same time.
Would it be 50 as well then?
Mhm.
Thank you.
50% VO2 max for an untrained person. Good. Okay, last topic in this chapter is active recovery, which we've actually already talked about, but I want to review it real quick. So active recovery, meaning when you finish your exercise, you don't just want to sit down, you want to remain active through your recovery. We talked about 2 reasons why we want to do that. Does anybody remember one of them?
The venous pooling.
Okay,
Yeah.
Rachel, do you want to explain that?
So when we exercise, all our blood is like it's related to the venous return mechanism. So we want our blood to go back up to our heart. So we have to utilize our skeletal muscle pump in order to prevent venous pooling, because venous pooling is when we see stars and we're dizzy, and it can lead to blacking out. So that's why it's important to keep moving, because we need to utilize those one-way valves to push the blood back up to our heart.
Very good. So we don't let people sit down right when their exercise is over, because we need to activate that skeletal muscle pump for venous return. Does anybody remember the other reason I gave for active recovery? This one was a while ago. Let's see if I can jog your memory. What enzyme goes here?
Lactate dehydrogenase.
Is this jogging anybody's memory? So lactate dehydrogenase, remember, works in both directions. It can take you from pyruvate to lactic acid or from lactic acid to pyruvate. So after you finish an exercise, you want to continue contracting your muscles, because in the slow twitch fibers, muscle contraction activates lactate dehydrogenase specifically in this direction, towards pyruvate. We want to bring lactic acid into the muscles so that the hydrogen doesn't accumulate, right? And once we do that, we can bring it in and it'll become what's over here.
Acetyl-CoA.
We can turn it into acetyl-CoA, go to the Krebs cycle and create ATP from it. Okay, so remember that one of the things we could do with lactic acid was to take it into other muscles to clear it. So that's what's happening here. If you've been sprinting and you've accumulated a lot of lactic acid in your legs, if you jog, that activates, the sprinting activated your fast twitch fibers that were producing lactic acid, right? If you jog, you're activating the slow twitch fibers, which will help you clear the lactic acid. So it's going to speed up your recovery. So this is most important, like for an athlete who has events, like for example, my son during track season, if he runs the mile and the 2 mile, he doesn't want me to talk about this. Oh, okay, anyway. So he'll run the mile, and the mile, hi Ceci. Hola Ceci. so when he runs the mile, if you're racing a mile, it's highly anaerobic. So he's producing and accumulating a lot of lactic acid. He's going to have his 2-mile race like an hour later. So it's essential that he clear as much of that lactic acid as possible. So as much as he wants to sit in between his races, he has to do cool down, because activating his slow twitch fibers is going to help him clear his lactic acid. So it might seem like it doesn't make sense. Like if you have 2 races that are an hour apart, you want to be resting in between. And that's true, you do need to rest in between, but you need the cool down to help you clear the lactic acid. So if you are, we talked about recovering the ATP PCR system and how replenishing that PCR takes how long?
3 to 5 minutes.
3 to 5 minutes to replenish the PCR. In glycolysis, if you drop your blood pH down to intolerable levels, which is not that hard to do, okay? I don't remember my numbers, but normal pH is 7 something. Intolerable pH is 6 something. So if you drop your pH down to intolerable levels, it can take 30 to 35 minutes to get back to normal. It takes a long time. So active recovery is going to help speed that up. Okay. Questions on any of that?
I have one question.
Yes.
You said, so the slow twitch fibers activate lactate dehydrogenase to turn the lactate
into pyruvate.
Okay, just clearing that up.
Yeah. In the fast twitch fibers, that enzyme prefers to work in the other direction, creating lactic acid. In the slow twitch fibers, it prefers to work bringing the lactic acid into the muscle. Okay. Rachel asked if this involves the Bohr effect. So the Bohr effect has to do with the pH getting oxygen dropped off of the muscle. So that has more to do with being able to do the exercise than now I'm talking about recovery. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. So that means we are done with chapter 8. That's chapter 8, right? 5, 6, yeah, we're done with chapter 8. So yes, active recovery would also help minimize EPOC, absolutely. So give you more of a cool down. So next lecture on Wednesday, we'll get into chapter 11, which is endurance training. We'll start out with endurance training and we'll fill out the rest of this table. Okay, so I do have office hours at 11. I can start right now with people who want to go over their exam one-on-one with me. And like, if you all tell me right now, I can make a list and we can make like 5-minute appointments. But I know that some of you are going to an 11 o'clock workshop. So you can just stick on with me. If you want to make an appointment with me, I can set those up right now, but during my office hours. The appointments will be during my office hours. All right, otherwise, okay, Nicole's letting me know. Nicole, you want to stay and do that right now? Lauren? Okay, Gwen. Rachel. Okay, if you're not sticking around for that, I'll see you Wednesday.